The gavel came down so hard, it split the wooden podium clean down the middle. Every soul in Redemption Creek's Main Street froze. The summer heat of 1882 pressed down on them like a flat iron, but not one person moved to fan themselves or step into the shade. They stood in a wide, uneven semicircle outside the first territorial bank of Redemption Creek, eyes wide and breath held, watching the two men face each other with nothing but 8 feet of sun-baked dirt between them. Cornelius Hatch, president of that bank, still had his hand raised where the gavel had struck. His face was the color of raw beef. His white collar was already ringed with sweat, and his silver pocket watch chain caught the noon light like a warning. Behind him, 3 men in suits stood holding a foreclosure notice so fresh the ink was barely dry, the kind of paper that could swallow a woman's entire life without a moment's apology. And in front of him stood Isaac Lorne. Isaac was not a small man. He stood at 6 feet and 2 inches of sun-darkened muscle and resolve, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the Guadalupe Mountains to the east. His cattleman's hat was pushed back off his forehead, and his gray eyes were fixed on Cornelius Hatch with an intensity that made several bystanders take an unconscious step backward. "You so much as slide that paper 1 inch further," Isaac said, his voice low and absolutely certain, "and I will make it my personal mission to ensure every rancher, every farmer, and every merchant within 100 miles of this town knows exactly what you did and exactly how you did it." Hatch laughed. "It was the wrong thing to do. Mr. Lorne, this is a legal proceeding. You have no standing here. The Everett land carries a debt that has come due, and if the widow cannot pay, her name," Isaac said, cutting straight through the man's speech like a blade through rope, "is Vera Everett, and her land is not for sale." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Redemption Creek had heard in years. It pressed down on the crowd harder than the heat. Children gripped their mothers' skirts. Old ranchers exchanged slow looks. A stray dog that had been lounging under the mercantile steps trotted quietly away. Vera Everett stood 15 feet behind Isaac. She had not asked him to do this. She had not even known he would be here today. She had come alone in her best wool dress despite the heat, carrying a leather satchel and the full weight of every secret and sorrow the last 2 years had laid across her shoulders. And now she stood watching this man, this impossibly stubborn, infuriating, proud cattleman, put himself directly in the path of the most powerful man in 3 counties, and she did not know whether to be furious or undone. She chose, in that moment, to be both. 18 months earlier, Vera Everett had arrived in Redemption Creek with dirt on her boots, grief in her chest, and a deed to 400 acres of Texas grassland that her late husband, Thomas Everett, had left her when a fever took him in the winter of 1880. Thomas had been a good man, quiet and steady, and he had loved her well in the 6 years they were married. But he had also, without telling her, taken a loan from Cornelius Hatch's bank to finance a second cattle run that never returned the profit he had projected. The cattle market had dropped sharply that season, the prices gutted by an oversupply from the northern ranges, and Thomas had died before he could repay a single dollar of principal. Vera had known about the loan, but not its size. That discovery had come in the form of a letter, delivered to the ranch house on the first cold morning of spring 1881, bearing the bank's letterhead and a number that made her sit down hard in the kitchen chair and stare at the wall for a long time. She had spent the 1.5 years since then doing everything a person could reasonably do to keep from drowning. She had sold off the secondary herd. She had taken in mending from the town seamstress. She had planted a kitchen garden and sold vegetables at the Saturday market. She had written to her brother in St. Louis, who had sent what he could, which was not enough. She had renegotiated the loan's repayment schedule twice, both times believing Hatch when he told her the terms were the best he could offer a woman in her situation. What she had not known, what she could not have known, was that Cornelius Hatch had wanted that 400 acres for longer than Thomas Everett had been dead. He wanted the creek that ran through the western edge of it, a permanent water source in a region where water was power. He wanted the grazing rights that came with it. He had been calculating from the beginning, and the loan he had extended to Thomas Everett had never been intended to be repaid. It had been intended to be defaulted upon, to fall precisely due on a date when Vera would have no recourse and no champion. He had simply not accounted for Isaac Lorne. Isaac had come to Redemption Creek 3 years before Vera arrived. He had ridden in from New Mexico with 300 head of longhorns, a working knowledge of water law, and a past he did not discuss unless the discussion was absolutely necessary. He had bought a modest piece of land north of town, built it up steadily, and had earned the respect of the ranching community through the straightforward method of being honest and keeping his word when everyone else was still deciding whether or not to give theirs. He had met Vera Everett by accident, the way most important things happen. It was a Tuesday in April of 1881, not quite 2 weeks after she had received that bank letter. Isaac had been riding the fence line of the Everett property's northern border, checking for breaks after a hard spring storm, because his cattle had a habit of wandering and her fence was older than it should have been. He had found a section of wire down and had stopped to assess the damage, and when he looked up from the broken post, he found a woman standing 30 yards away watching him with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and suspicion. She was holding a fence stretcher in one hand and a length of new wire in the other. She had clearly ridden out with the intention of doing this repair herself. She was wearing a man's work coat over a dark dress, her dark brown hair pinned back but coming loose at the temples from the wind. She was not asking for help, she was waiting to see what he intended to do. "I was checking for breaks," he said. "Found this one, figured I should let you know." "I can see it myself," she said. "Yes," he said, "I see that." There was a pause. "I have the wire," she said. "You also have 2 of mine on your side of the fence," he said, nodding to where 2 of his branded longhorns stood in the shadow of a live oak, watching the scene with bovine indifference. "I would consider helping fix this a fair trade for getting my cattle back without a fuss." She looked at the longhorns. She looked at him. She looked at the broken post. "Fine," she said. They had worked in near silence for the better part of an hour, and Isaac had learned 3 things about Vera Everett in that time. She was competent with her hands in a way that came from genuine experience, not pride. She was carrying something heavy and choosing not to show it. And she had the most precise, unflinching dark eyes he had ever looked into, the kind of eyes that made you feel that being less than entirely honest would be both obvious and beneath you. He had ridden home thinking about those eyes for an unreasonable length of time. They had crossed paths a dozen more times over the following weeks, the way neighbors do when they share a fence line and a habit of being up before dawn. Isaac had begun checking his northern fence more often than strict necessity required, a fact he did not examine too closely. Vera had begun to leave the front gate of the yard unlatched on mornings when she was working outside, which he chose to interpret as a form of welcome, though he was careful not to presume. In May, he had come to her door with a proper reason. 3 of her heifers had wound up in his pasture through a gap neither of them had noticed, and he had penned them separately so they would not mix with his bull. He had knocked, hat in hand, and she had opened the door and looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read, before stepping back to invite him in for coffee. The kitchen was clean and spare, and had the particular feeling of a space maintained by one person where there had once been two. There was a man's coat still hanging on a peg by the back door. There was a photograph on the shelf above the stove that Isaac did not look at directly but registered in his peripheral vision. She poured the coffee without asking how he took it, which meant she had paid attention on some previous occasion he could not immediately identify. And they sat at the table and talked for 40 minutes about cattle and water rights, and the difficulty of maintaining fence on clay soil. And when he left, he was aware that he had not wanted to leave, and that this was becoming a more pressing problem than the heifers. She told him about the loan in June. It came out not as a confession but as a piece of practical information, the way she shared most things that mattered to her. She had been reviewing her accounts at the kitchen table when he arrived one afternoon with a report that the eastern section of her range was showing early signs of overgrazing, and he thought she might want to rotate the herd. She thanked him and then looked at the papers in front of her with an expression that had gone very still, and she said, simply, that she was not sure she would have the herd to worry about by the following spring. He sat down without being invited and she told him, not everything at once. She was not a woman who spoke in floods, but she told him the number and the timeline and the fact that Hatch had told her at their last meeting that the land was her only real collateral and that if she could not meet the final payment, the bank would have no choice. Isaac's expression during this recitation was unreadable to anyone who did not know him. To anyone who did, the quality of his stillness said everything. He told you that in those words, Isaac said, that the land was your only real collateral. He told me that, Vera said. And the payment schedule he offered you the second time you renegotiated. Did you get it in writing? I have the papers. May I see them? She had looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen table. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the wooden surface between them like a line neither of them had crossed yet. Then she had gone to the drawer in the cabinet by the stove and brought back the folder. He spent 20 minutes reading the documents carefully. Vera did not watch him. She looked out the window and drank her coffee and let him work. When he set the papers down, he was quiet for a moment. The original loan terms were different from what's described here, he said. I know. You still have the original papers. I have everything Thomas ever signed. Then there may be a case that these renegotiated terms are not what they were presented to be, he said. But Vera, he paused. Hatch has Judge Perriman in his pocket. You likely already know that. I know, she said. Which means a legal challenge, at least locally, is probably not worth the cost, she said. I was going to say difficult, he said carefully. Not impossible. She looked at him then. Really looked at him, the way she rarely let herself, the kind of looking that moved past the practical surface of things and into the current beneath. Why are you doing this? She asked, not accusingly, genuinely. He held her gaze and answered honestly, because that was the only kind of answer he knew how to give her. Because what is happening to you is wrong, he said, and because I can help. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she said, all right. Those two words, quiet and deliberate and given with full knowledge of what they were doing, were the beginning of something that neither of them said out loud for a considerable time afterward. Through the summer and into the fall of 1881, Isaac and Vera worked the problem together with the methodical determination of people who could not afford to fail. He knew water law from his New Mexico years and understood Hatch's interest in the creek running through the Everett property. He reached out to a land attorney in San Antonio named Delbert Crane, who had a reputation for taking cases against banking institutions, and a particular dislike of Cornelius Hatch, that dated back to a foreclosure dispute in Bexar County, several years prior. Crane wrote back with cautious optimism and a list of documents he would need to assess the situation. In the meantime, Vera was not idle. She had a mind that her late husband had always admired, and that the town of Redemption Creek had largely underestimated because she was a widow in a wool dress who sold vegetables on Saturdays. She went through every paper Thomas had kept, every ledger entry, every scrap of correspondence, and she found things that had not been obvious at first reading. She found a discrepancy in the interest calculations that amounted to $40 across the life of the loan, which was not large but was indicative of a pattern. She found a letter from Hatch's clerk to Thomas, dated 3 months before the loan was signed, that suggested the terms had been orally represented as significantly more favorable than what had ended up in writing. She cataloged everything. She made copies in her neat, precise handwriting. She sent the originals to Delbert Crane in San Antonio in a package wrapped in oilcloth and tied twice with twine. Isaac watched her do all of this and said very little, because she did not need commentary, and he understood that. What he did, in those months, was show up. He was there on the days when the problem felt too large to hold. He was there when the roof on the east outbuilding leaked and needed patching before the fall rains. He was there when 2 of her cows calved early, and she needed an extra pair of hands at 4 in the morning. He asked for nothing in return for any of it, which Vera found simultaneously touching and slightly exasperating, because she was a woman who understood the weight of obligation and who preferred her debts to be acknowledged and accounted for. "You do not have to keep doing this," she told him one evening in September, when they were sitting on her porch after a long day and the first cooler air of the season was coming down from the north. "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you to stop," she said carefully. "I am asking you to tell me what you want in return." He was quiet for a moment. The evening was very still. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the oak tree by the gate. "I want you to stop worrying that there is some hidden motive," he said. "There is not." She looked at him. The light was almost gone by then, just the last thin edge of orange at the horizon, and his face was mostly in shadow, but she could see the line of his jaw and the particular quality of his attention. "You are either the most genuinely honest man I have ever met," she said slowly, "or you are very good at appearing to be." "I am not sure those are different things," he said. She considered that for a moment. Then something in her shoulders settled, some small tension she had been carrying for weeks without entirely knowing it. "No," she said. "I suppose they are not." The mockingbird kept singing. Neither of them moved to go inside for a long time. October brought Delbert Crane's first substantive letter. He had reviewed the documents and believed there was a genuine case to be made that the loan had been misrepresented at origination, and furthermore that the renegotiated payment schedule contained a clause that, under Texas territorial law, was potentially unenforceable. The problem, as Isaac had predicted, was the local judiciary. Crane recommended they pursue a challenge at the district level in San Antonio, which meant time and money, both of which were limited. It also meant that the foreclosure date Hatch had set, which was now less than 9 months away, needed to be addressed. Isaac spent 2 weeks in October riding to neighboring ranches and talking to people he had built credit with over 3 years of honest dealing. He was not asking for charity. He was asking for the kind of practical solidarity that the ranching community understood when one of their own was being squeezed by a banking interest. Several people listened, and several people promised what they could. An older rancher named Franklin Doss, who had run cattle in Texas since before the war and who had no use for Cornelius Hatch, agreed to co-sign a short-term bridge loan from a bank in El Paso that would cover the bulk of Vera's final payment, buying them time to pursue the legal challenge. When Isaac came back from the last of those rides and knocked on Vera's door and laid out what he had arranged, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not the composed, careful look she usually wore. It was something more open, more raw, and it lasted only a moment before she pulled it back under control. "You rode to 7 ranches," she said. "8, he said. "You could have simply offered to loan me the money yourself," she said. She knew from the general shape of things that he could have covered it or close to it. "Yes," he said. "But that would have left you obligated to me specifically, and that is not the kind of arrangement either of us should be comfortable with." She was quiet for a moment. "Because of what you feel," she said, not a question. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "because of what I feel." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like rushing water. "Isaac," she said, "you do not have to say anything," he said. "I am not asking for anything. I meant what I said." "I know you did," she said, "but I am going to say something anyway." She took a breath. "I have been telling myself since April that what I feel when you are here is simply gratitude. I have been very committed to that explanation. And," he said, "and it is not entirely accurate," she said. "That is what I wanted to say." He did not move from the doorway. He was being very careful, she could see, giving her room. "What would be a more accurate description?" he asked quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. This careful, steadfast, infuriatingly honest man who had shown up in her life at the exact moment when she had needed someone, and had proceeded to be exactly who he appeared to be without deviation or pretense. "I am not sure yet," she said honestly. "But I wanted you to know that the question is open." He nodded slowly, as if he were accepting the terms of something. "I can work with that," he said. She felt, very unexpectedly, a warmth move through her chest that she had thought she was done with. November came with a cold front and a new complication. Cornelius Hatch had apparently become aware that something was in motion against his foreclosure plan, because he revised his timeline without notice. His clerk arrived at the Everett property on the second Monday of November with a letter informing Vera that due to a re-evaluation of the loan terms, the full outstanding balance was now due in 30 days rather than the following spring, citing an obscure clause in the original loan documents. Isaac read the letter twice. The muscle in his jaw worked. "Can he do this?" Vera asked. "He is doing it," Isaac said. "Whether he can legally do it is a different question." He rode to the telegraph office in Redemption Creek the next morning and sent a wire to Delbert Crane in San Antonio. Crane's response came within 2 days and was characteristically measured but clear. The clause Hatch was invoking was of questionable validity under Texas law, but contesting it required going to the district court, which would take longer than 30 days. They needed an injunction. This was the first time Isaac felt the full weight of what they were up against. Not the size of the problem, which he had known from the beginning, but its timing. A legal injunction from the San Antonio District Court was not something you could conjure in a month. Crane could file immediately, but the pace of the territorial justice system was not designed for emergencies. He went back to Vera's house that evening and sat at the kitchen table and laid out the situation without softening it, because that was not something he did with her. "If we cannot get an injunction in time," he said, "Hatch can move on the foreclosure. With Perriman on his side, the local process will be quick." "And the El Paso bridge loan," Vera said. "It covers the original payment amount which was due in the spring. Not the full outstanding balance he is now demanding." She sat with this for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table, very still. "What are the options?" she asked. "Three," he said. "Crane files for the injunction and we push as hard as we can on the timing, which is uncertain. I go back to the ranching community and try to pull together the full outstanding balance in 30 days, which is a great deal of money in a very short time and may not be possible. Or," he paused, "or," she said. "Or we go at Hatch directly," he said. "Publicly. I have been looking at what Crane sent about the loan misrepresentation, and there is enough there that if I confront Hatch in front of the town, in front of witnesses, in a way that forces him to either back down or expose his methods, he may choose to back down rather than have his practices examined in front of everyone who banks with him." Vera looked at him steadily. "That is a dangerous strategy," she said. "If he does not back down, we have simply told him we have the documents." "He already knows we have documents," Isaac said. "The wire to Crane was sent from the public telegraph office. He has a man there." He said this without particular emotion, as a simple fact about how Hatch operated. "So he already knows we are pursuing the legal route," she said. "Yes. Which means the element of surprise, such as it is, lies in the public confrontation. He calculates everything. What he cannot easily calculate is public sentiment, especially from the ranching community." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "He will hate being challenged publicly," she said slowly. "He will hate it enormously," Isaac said. "He is a man who depends on the appearance of unquestionable authority. A public challenge that he cannot manage quietly is his particular vulnerability. But it requires you to stand up in the main street and tell him what you know," she said, "in front of everyone." "Yes," he said. "And risk that he comes at you next," she said. "He already thinks of me as an obstacle," Isaac said. "I would rather be an obstacle he underestimates than one he has already mapped and planned for." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze and said nothing, because he understood that she needed to think without the pressure of his expression asking something of her. "All right," she said finally. "But we do it together. I come with you." "Vera, together," she said, in a tone that closed the discussion. "It is my land. I will not stand behind you while you fight for it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his gray eyes that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "Together," he agreed. They spent the next week preparing. Isaac reached out to Franklin Doss and 2 other ranchers who knew Hatch's history and were willing to be present. He sent another wire to Crane with details of the accelerated timeline. He reviewed everything Vera had documented and selected the 2 most damaging pieces of evidence: the discrepancy in the interest calculations and the clerk's letter about the oral misrepresentation of the original terms. He also, very quietly, arranged for the Redemption Creek Weekly Courier to have their reporter present on the day they had identified as most likely to be Hatch's next move. The reporter, a young man named Edgar Forsyth, had been looking for a story about Hatch for 2 years and had never had the evidence or the witnesses to print it. Vera, in the meantime, was handling the emotional architecture of what they were about to do with the same precise competence she brought to everything else, which did not mean she was not feeling it. On the evening before the confrontation, they sat on her porch in the November cold, wrapped in their coats, and she was quieter than usual. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, the way she did with most things he asked her. "Of losing the land," she said. "Yes. I have been afraid of that for 18 months. A pause. Of tomorrow, less than I thought I would be." "Why less?" She turned to look at him. In the cold evening light, her face was very clear, very open in a way she rarely allowed. "Because I am not doing it alone," she said. He felt something in his chest that had been wound tight for months begin, very slowly to ease. "No," he said. "You are not. She leaned forward slightly and pressed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that for a long time in the cold and the quiet, not saying anything more, because there was not anything more that needed to be said. The day of the confrontation came sharp and bright, the sky the deep clear blue of a Texas November, the air cold enough to show breath. Vera dressed carefully, not in her working clothes but in the good wool dress and her late husband's coat, which was too large for her but had been patched and fitted as well as she could manage, and which she wore partly for warmth and partly, she supposed, for something that was not quite superstition but was close to it. She took the leather satchel with the copies of the documents, locked the house, and rode into Redemption Creek. Isaac was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the livery, talking to Franklin Doss in a low voice, and when he looked up and saw her coming down the main street, he watched her for a moment in a way that made her feel, despite the cold and the fear and the impossibility of the morning, steady. They had learned from Crane that Hatch intended to file his formal foreclosure notice at the town records office before noon, which under the accelerated timeline would begin a 10-day final window. The plan was to intercept him before he filed, in front of as many witnesses as possible. Hatch came out of the bank at 11:45 with his clerk and two of his associates, the foreclosure documents in a leather portfolio under his arm, and walked directly into the gathered presence of more people than he had anticipated. Franklin Doss and his two sons, 3 ranchers from the Western District, Edgar Forsyth from the Courier with his notebook, a dozen townspeople who had heard, in the way that news moves in small towns, that something was happening, and Vera Everett, standing in the middle of the main street with her satchel in her hand, and beside her, Isaac Lorne. Hatch had stopped at the sight of them and gathered himself quickly, because he was a man of considerable experience in making difficult situations appear routine. He smiled and said something about legal business and private matters, and he moved to step around them. Isaac stepped to meet him. "You are about to file a foreclosure notice on the Everett property," Isaac said, loudly enough for everyone present to hear, "based on a 30-day demand that relies on a clause in a loan document that was, according to a land attorney in San Antonio, of highly questionable legal standing. Before you do, I think these people deserve to hear why." Hatch's face had changed. The smile remained, but it had become a fixed, effortful thing. "Mr. Lorne, I am not going to stand in the street and discuss bank business with a man who has no legal standing in this matter." "Then stand in the street and discuss it with me," Vera said, stepping forward. Her voice was clear and absolutely steady. Hatch looked at her with an expression that contained, very briefly, something calculated and cold before the banking president's mask settled back over it. "Mrs. Everett, I have enormous sympathy for your situation. You misrepresented the terms of this loan," she said, "in writing, before my husband signed it." She opened the satchel and held up the clerk's letter. "Your own employee described the terms in a letter dated 3 months before the signing date, and those terms are materially different from what ended up in the document my husband signed. This is not a matter of sympathy. It is a matter of fraud." The word landed in the gathered crowd like a stone in still water. Hatch's face had gone the color it was now, the raw beef red. And that was when he had raised the gavel he was still carrying from a morning auction and brought it down on the wooden podium that his clerk had set up outside the bank for the formal filing, and it had split the podium clean down the middle, which was where the story had begun. Now, with the broken podium between them and the crowd absolutely still, Hatch collected himself with visible effort. "This is a legal matter," he said, his voice tight. The documents are properly executed. Any claims of misrepresentation require proof that will stand up in a court of law. They will stand up, Isaac said. We have both the documents and the testimony. What we also have, he continued, is this. He reached into his coat and produced a single folded paper. A request from the San Antonio District Court, filed yesterday afternoon by attorney Delbert Crane, for an injunction on any foreclosure proceedings against the Everett property pending review of the origination and renegotiation documents. That injunction will be granted. He did not know this for certain. Crane had filed and Crane was good, but the injunction was not yet in hand. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who had spent 3 years building a reputation on every word being true. And he watched Cornelius Hatch read the weight of that certainty in the faces of the people standing around them. Edgar Forsyth was writing very quickly. Franklin Doss said, from somewhere behind Isaac's left shoulder, with the slow authority of a man who had been running cattle in Texas for 40 years. I think every person in this town with money in your bank is going to want to know the answers to these questions, Cornelius. So does everyone who is standing here right now. There was a murmur from the crowd. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Hatch stood very still for a long moment. He looked at the broken podium. He looked at Vera. He looked at Isaac. He looked at the faces of the people around him. People who kept accounts in his bank. People who knew other people. People whose trust he depended on in a town of 600 souls, where there was no other way to rebuild reputation once it was gone. There will be no filing today, he said finally. The words cost him something. They were clipped and controlled and entirely furious. The bank will review the situation and respond through proper channels. He turned and walked back into the bank. His clerk and associates followed. The door closed behind them. The crowd exhaled. Vera closed the leather satchel with hands that were not entirely steady and stood for a moment looking at the broken podium. Isaac was beside her. He did not touch her, because they were standing in the main street of Redemption Creek in front of 50 people. But he turned to look at her, and when she looked back at him, the thing between them was very close to the surface, barely covered by the formality of the moment. He will come back, she said quietly. He will, Isaac said, but he will come back through legal channels, and that is where we are stronger. Franklin Doss was at her elbow. You did well, Mrs. Everett, he said simply. She nodded and thanked him with genuine warmth. Edgar Forsyth was already heading toward the telegraph office to wire his story to the regional papers. Delbert Crane's injunction was granted 11 days later. The legal process took 5 more months and involved 2 trips to San Antonio, one by Isaac and one by Vera, and several weeks of depositions and filings, and the particular grinding tedium of justice working itself out through the machinery of the law. Crane was good. The documents were good. And Cornelius Hatch, when forced to defend his methods in a formal legal setting rather than through the quiet exercise of local power, proved to be considerably less invulnerable than he had appeared. The district court found in February of 1883 that the original loan had been made under materially misrepresented terms, that the interest over charges had compounded across the life of the loan to an amount that, when applied to the outstanding balance, effectively cleared it, and that the accelerated demand Hatch had issued was without valid legal basis. The outstanding balance was formally resolved. The deed to the Everett property was unencumbered. Vera received this news in a letter from Crane on a cold February afternoon. She read it sitting at the kitchen table and then sat very still for a moment. Then she went to the door and looked out at the land that was hers, The brown winter grass and the bare branched cottonwoods along the creek and the cold pale sky above it, and she breathed it in. She sent a note to Isaac. He arrived within the hour, as if he had been waiting, which she later understood he had been. He came in and she handed him the letter and he read it. When he looked up, his expression was different from his usual careful control. Something in it was open and unguarded and very warm. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then she said very quietly, "I do not want to call what I feel gratitude any more." He set the letter down slowly on the table. "What do you want to call it?" he asked. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed him. It was not tentative. She was not a woman who did things tentatively once she had decided to do them. He brought his hands up to her face, careful and certain at the same time, and kissed her back. And for a long moment, the kitchen was very quiet except for the wind outside and the sound of their breathing. When they separated, she looked at him from close range and there was color in her face and something absolutely alive in her dark eyes. "That," she said. "Yes," he said, without any pretense of not understanding. "That." It was Isaac who pulled back slightly, not out of want but out of something very like seriousness. "I need you to know something," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me." "The dark past you have probably wondered about," he said. From before New Mexico, she had wondered. She had not asked, because it was not her habit to take things that were not offered, but she had wondered. "Tell me," she said again, simply. He moved to the table and sat, and she sat across from him, and he told her. His father had been a land speculator in Kansas in the early 1870s. A man who had operated along the margins of legality, and sometimes well past them. Isaac had worked for him as a young man, not knowing the full scope of what his father was doing until he was old enough and experienced enough to see it clearly. When he had seen it clearly, he had refused to continue and had left. The estrangement was complete and permanent. His father had died in 1878, leaving debts and a name that Isaac had chosen, deliberately, not to trade on, which was why he had gone west and built something from nothing using only what he could honestly claim as his own work. "I did not have a hidden role in what happened to Thomas," he said. He said this very directly, holding her gaze because it was the thing he most needed her to know. "I did not think you did," she said. "But you wondered about the timing," he said. "My arrival here, the fence line being so close, you are too careful not to have wondered." She considered being offended and decided it was more honest to be truthful. "I wondered briefly," she said. "In the beginning, and then I watched you for 3 months and concluded that if you had any hidden motive I was not smart enough to find it. You are the smartest person I know," he said. "Then you have your answer," she said. Something in his face shifted, some last residue of tension letting go. "My answer," he said quietly, warmly. She reached across the table and took his hand. In the spring of 1883, they were married on the Everett property, in the yard behind the house, with the cottonwoods beginning to green and the creek running clear and cold through the western edge of the land. Franklin Doss was there, and Edgar Forsyth, and the seamstress from town who had given Vera mending work in the lean years, and who cried satisfyingly throughout the ceremony. Delbert Crane sent a letter of congratulations from San Antonio. A small handful of neighboring ranchers and their families filled the yard with the particular cheerful noise of people who had reason to be happy. The Reverend from the Redemption Creek Church, a steady man named Reverend Hubbard who had watched the events of the previous year with quiet approval, performed the ceremony under the oak tree. When Isaac took Vera's hands at the beginning of the ceremony, he held them with a steadiness that she recognized, the same steadiness that had been present every time he showed up when she needed him. the same steadiness that had nothing performative in it and everything genuine. She looked at him with the full, open expression she had slowly learned to let him see, the one that was not managing anything or maintaining any careful distance. She said her vows in a clear, unhurried voice. He said his in the same way, quietly and absolutely, as if they were simply true statements that happened also to be promises. Afterward, when the cake had been cut and the toasts had been made and the last of the guests were drifting toward their horses in the warm spring evening, Isaac found her standing by the creek in the fading light. She was looking at the water. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking about Thomas," she said. "I think he would have liked you." He was quiet for a moment, respecting the weight of that. "I think he must have been a good man," he said. "He was," she said. "He was quiet and kind and not very good at numbers, which is partly what got us into trouble." A pause and something almost light in her voice. "You are quite good at numbers." "I am spectacular at numbers," he said, with a gravity so profound it was clearly something else entirely. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and he looked at her with an expression that was transparent in its depth. "I love you," he said. He had not said it before in those words, only in the accumulated weight of everything he had done and everything he had been. She looked at him. The creek ran past them in the evening light. The first stars were beginning to appear. "I know," she said. "I love you too." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood there by the water until the light was nearly gone, and then longer still, because there was no particular reason to hurry. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty, because real life is not structured to spare people from difficulty, even when they have earned a rest. The cattle market remained volatile through 1883, and managing the combined Lorne and Everett operations required careful navigation of cash flow and grazing rotation, and the perpetual uncertainties of weather. There was a dry summer that reduced the creek's flow to a worrying trickle for 6 weeks in August and September, and required Isaac to build a second water tank on the northern range, which was hard work in brutal heat. There was also the matter of Cornelius Hatch, who had not entirely disappeared from their lives. He remained president of the First Territorial Bank of Redemption Creek, though Edgar Forsyth's article had been picked up by the regional papers, and his reputation had been meaningfully damaged. He had lost 2 substantial business accounts in the aftermath of the district court ruling, and he had looked at Isaac with a cold fury at every town event they both attended, which was not often, but often enough to remind both of them that the conflict had not dissolved simply because it had been resolved. In October of 1883, Hatch made one final attempt at a different kind of pressure. He called in a short-term note that an older rancher named Archie Belmont held with the bank, a note Belmont had taken to repair his barn after a fire and which had 2 months left to run. The implied message was clear. Those who had stood in the main street on the day of the confrontation were not forgotten. Isaac found out about this on a Monday and rode to Belmont's ranch on Tuesday. He had a direct conversation with Archie Belmont about the situation, and then rode to the bank and sat down across from Hatch in his paneled office, and had a different kind of direct conversation, quieter but no less certain than the one in the main street. "You are going to honor the terms of Belmont's note," Isaac said, "and every other note you hold in this county is going to run to its contracted term without interference. Because if anything different happens, I am going to the state banking authority in Austin with everything we collected for the district court case, and I am going to let them review your entire loan portfolio, and you are going to lose your charter." Hatch looked at him from across the polished desk. "That is a significant threat," Hatch said. "It is a significant promise," Isaac said. "There is a difference." Hatch was quiet for a moment. His face worked through several things and settled on something that was not quite defeat but was adjacent to it. "Belmont's note will run to term," Hatch said. "Thank you," Isaac said with perfect courtesy and left. He told Vera about it that evening. She listened and then looked at him with that precise, unflinching expression of hers. "Did you actually think he would break?" she asked. "I thought he would calculate," Isaac said. "He did. He is primarily a man of self-interest, not principle. Self-interest told him to back down." "And if he had not?" "Then I would have gone to Austin," Isaac said simply. "I have everything." She nodded, satisfied. She never doubted that he would do what he said. That was, she had come to understand, one of the specific and irreplaceable qualities of this particular man. Archie Belmont's note ran to its contracted term and was repaid without incident. Hatch made no further moves against anyone associated with that day in the Main Street. He remained in Redemption Creek and continued to run his bank, diminished in influence, constrained by the knowledge of what Isaac held, and slowly edged toward irrelevance as the newer bank that opened in the spring of 1884 began drawing accounts away from him with more transparent practices. By the winter of 1883 going into 1884, Vera was expecting their first child. She told Isaac on a cold December evening by the fire, in the direct, matter-of-fact way she had told him all the other important things. And he looked at her for a moment, and then got up from his chair, and came to sit beside her on the settle and put his arm around her, and held her with a tenderness that she felt go all the way through her. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Some," she said honestly, "but mostly glad." "I am more than glad," he said. "I am not sure I have a word for what I am." "You are an excellent man with numbers who is briefly at a loss," she said. He pressed his face into her hair, and she felt the laughter in his chest. Their son was born in July of 1884, arriving in the heat of a summer storm with the thunder rolling in from the west, and the rain hammering on the roof of the ranch house. He was a healthy, vigorous child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's precise and slightly imperious regard for the world, and they named him Thomas William Lorne. Thomas for the man whose land had become their home and whose memory Vera still carried with the quiet respect it deserved, and William for Isaac's grandfather, who had been the one honest man in his father's story. The name felt right. It felt like a thing that honored without being burdened. Vera said so, and Isaac held their son and looked down at him and agreed. The years that followed had the particular quality of a life built on solid ground, which does not mean they were without trouble or change, but means they moved through both with the foundation intact. The ranch grew steadily as Isaac and Vera managed it together with the combination of his range knowledge and her financial precision, a partnership that was, as Franklin Doss observed to his sons one afternoon, about as well matched a pair of ranching minds as he had seen in 40 years. Redemption Creek grew too. The railroad came through in 1886, changing the character of the cattle trade and requiring Isaac to renegotiate his shipping arrangements, which he did with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. New families arrived. The town built a proper schoolhouse and hired a teacher, and young Thomas Lorne was among its first students, attending with the grave seriousness of a 4-year-old who had already formed strong opinions about everything. Edgar Forsyth's article about the Hatch case had, eventually, been picked up by papers as far as Fort Worth, and contributed to a broader discussion about banking practices in Texas territories that was part of a wave of legal reform gradually moving through the region. This was a larger justice than any single case could achieve, but Vera noted it and thought about it with quiet satisfaction. Their second child came in 1887, a daughter they named Clara Mee Lorne, who arrived in the spring with considerable energy and a set of opinions about her sleeping schedule that she enforced with remarkable determination. Thomas, who was 3 years old, regarded his new sister with the cautious assessment of a person confronted with a surprise that was turning out to be more interesting than expected. Isaac watched his children and his wife in the light of a spring evening and felt something he had not expected to be capable of feeling when he rode into Redemption Creek 8 years before with 300 head of cattle and a past he was learning to set down. He felt entirely, unreservedly at home. He said this to Vera one evening on the porch, where they had taken to sitting after the children were in bed, because some habits that begin in one kind of moment become the structure of an entire life. "I did not know what home felt like," he said. "Before this. I had a sense of what it was supposed to be, but I had not felt it." She was quiet for a moment, her hand in his. "I had felt it," she said, "with Thomas, and then I lost it and I was not sure I would find it again." A pause. "I am glad I was wrong." "I am glad you were wrong too," he said. She turned to look at him, and in the evening light she had the expression she wore when she was seeing him completely. No reserve, no management, just the full, clear depth of what she felt. "Isaac," she said. "Yes," he said, already knowing from the tone that this was not a practical matter. "I want you to know that I love you in a way that has nothing to do with what you did," she said carefully. "Not the land and not the bank and not any of it. I loved you before it was resolved, and I would love you if it had not been. I need you to know that because I was not able to say it clearly at the time." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening was very quiet, just the sound of the wind and the far-off call of a nighthawk. "I know," he said. "I always knew that." "How?" she asked. "Because of how you looked at me after you kissed me," he said. "It was not the look of a woman who was grateful. It was the look of a woman who had decided something." She considered this. "That is an embarrassingly accurate observation," she said. "I have been studying your expressions for several years," he said. "I have developed some expertise." She laughed softly and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable warmth of two people who had found each other through difficulty and stayed. The following spring of 1888 brought an interesting development in the form of a letter from Delbert Crane, now practicing in Austin, who wrote to tell them that Cornelius Hatch had finally surrendered his bank's charter, and the First Territorial Bank of Redemption Creek had been absorbed by the new institution. The building was being repurposed as the town's second general store. Hatch himself had relocated to Galveston, apparently to pursue interests in the shipping trade. Isaac read this letter aloud to Vera over breakfast. "Good riddance," she said, buttering her bread with perfect equanimity. "I would not put it that unkindly," Isaac said. "I would," she said. "But I am glad he is gone." He folded the letter and set it aside, and they both understood that a chapter, the longest and most difficult chapter of what their life had grown from, was genuinely, finally, closed. That summer, Vera went to the western edge of their property and walked down to the creek and stood for a long time in the shade of the cottonwoods. The water was running well, the summer rains having been generous, and it caught the light in the particular way that moving water does, endlessly changing and endlessly the same. She thought about the night she had received that first bank letter, sitting alone in this kitchen with a number in front of her that felt like the end of everything. She thought about a man showing up at the fence line on a Tuesday in April with 2 of his cattle, and the uncomplicated honesty of someone who had nothing to hide. She thought about what it had felt like to stop being alone with all of it, and how that feeling had changed everything, not because it had changed the problem, but because it had changed the weight of carrying it. Isaac found her there, as he often found her when she had gone quiet for a while, and he had waited the right amount of time. He came and stood beside her and looked at the water. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the same question he had asked on their wedding day. "That I am very grateful," she said, "for the honest version of it, not the kind that is debt but the kind that is recognition." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. "I am grateful too," he said. "For what specifically?" She asked, with the slight precision that never fully left her, even in the most expansive moments. "For the fact that you were in the yard on a Tuesday morning in April with a fence stretcher and a length of wire," he said, "instead of waiting for someone else to do it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with great warmth and just enough dryness to be entirely herself, "You repaired approximately 2 feet of that fence. I did the rest." "I drove the post," he said. "After I handed you the post driver," she said. "True," he said. "But I drove it very competently." She laughed and turned her face up to him, and he kissed her there by the creek in the summer light, their land stretching out behind them, wide and quiet and entirely their own. Their third child arrived in the spring of 1890, a second son whom they named Elias James Lorne, arriving in a tremendous hurry on a clear April morning, delivered efficiently by the town doctor, and received with great enthusiasm by his older brother Thomas, who at 5.5 years old had decided he preferred a brother to a second sister, and was entirely undisguised about this preference, in a way that required a gentle parental conversation about graciousness. Clara Mee, at 3 years old, had no strong opinions about her new brother's arrival, except that she did not intend to share her mother's attention with him for any longer than was absolutely necessary, a position she expressed with a directness that Vera privately found familiar. "She reminds me of someone," Isaac said one evening, watching Clara Mee conduct a systematic negotiation with her older brother over the distribution of cornbread at supper. "I cannot imagine who," Vera said, without looking up from the pot she was tending. He pressed his lips together in the expression that was not quite a smile. By 1892, the Lorne Ranch had grown to 640 acres, expanded by the purchase of the adjacent property to the north, when its owner had decided to retire and move to his daughter's home in Houston. The cattle operation was one of the steadiest in the county, not the largest, but with a reputation for honest dealing in the cattle market that regularly produced better prices than operations twice its size. Isaac had developed a particular interest in water management, a legacy of his experience with Vera's Creek, and had become something of an informal consultant to neighboring ranchers on the subject of sustainable grazing and water conservation, which was becoming an increasingly serious concern as the decade wore on and more operations competed for the same finite resources. Vera ran the books for the operation with the same precision she had brought to her own accounts in the difficult years, and had branched out into helping 2 neighboring ranches understand and renegotiate their own banking arrangements, a service she provided with characteristic thoroughness and no charge. The new bank in Redemption Creek, under its more honest management, had been cooperative and straightforward, and she had developed a working relationship with its president, a sensible woman named Margaret Hollies, who had taken on the role after her husband's retirement, and who was one of the few people in the county whose financial judgment Vera fully respected. Thomas, at 8 years old, was already helping with the lighter cattle work in the way that children on working ranches do, with the gravity and pride of someone given a real responsibility. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's observant eyes, and Isaac watched him grow with an emotion he found difficult to categorize, except as something that had nothing to do with legacy or pride in the conventional sense, and everything to do with the specific and irreplaceable reality of this particular person. "He is going to be good at this," Isaac told Vera one afternoon, watching Thomas carefully check the water level in the south tank with a wooden measuring rod as Isaac had shown him. "He is good at anything he decides to take seriously," Vera said, "which is most things." "Clara will be different," Isaac said, with the tone of someone who has made a careful observation over time. "Clara will be better," Vera said, "at the things she chooses. The rest she will refuse to do with complete confidence." "She gets that from you," he said. "She absolutely does," Vera agreed, entirely without apology. In the fall of 1892, Redemption Creek held its 10th anniversary celebration as an incorporated town. A 3-day affair with a market, a dance, and a series of speeches by various community figures that ran considerably longer than anyone had hoped. Isaac was asked to speak at the Saturday evening gathering, in recognition of his role in the community over the previous decade, and he declined in favor of Vera, whom he described to the organizing committee as the person whose work and judgment had actually earned whatever regard he was being offered a share of. The organizing committee, after some discussion, agreed that Mrs. Lorne would speak. Vera spoke for exactly 7 minutes because she was not a person who spoke for more time than the thought required. She talked about the creek that ran through their western boundary and about water and land, and what it meant to hold something, and what it cost when that holding was threatened. She talked about the community that had gathered in the main street on a cold November day in 1881, and what that gathering had meant, and what it represented about the kind of place Redemption Creek was capable of being. She did not mention Cornelius Hatch by name, because she saw no need to recall him in a speech about what was good. She thanked Franklin Doss, who was in the audience, and who waved off the acknowledgement with characteristic gruffness. And she said at the end that the most important thing she had learned in the years she had lived here was that a piece of land was worth exactly what the people who loved it were willing to do for each other, and that in her experience in this particular place, that amount had been considerable. There was warm and genuine applause. Isaac, sitting in the audience with Clara on his knee and Thomas beside him, watched her and felt the particular pride that has nothing to do with possession, the kind that is simply recognition. That this woman, this specific and irreplaceable woman, had always been exactly this, and that knowing her was the great good fortune of his life. She found him in the crowd afterward, and he took her hand and said quietly, "That was very well said." "Thank you," she said. "You should have done it yourself." "No," he said, "I should not have." She looked at him and understood and did not argue. The dance was held in the street, fiddles and a squeeze box, the lanterns strung between the buildings throwing warm orange light on the packed earth. Isaac was not a natural dancer, but had been earnestly improving under Vera's instruction for several years, to the point where he was now consistently competent, rather than occasionally hazardous to those nearby. They danced together in the warm fall evening while Franklin Doss watched the children, and the fiddles played, and the whole of Redemption Creek moved in the lantern light, and Isaac held Vera in the loose, easy way of two people who have danced together enough times to have stopped thinking about the mechanics of it, and simply moved together. "Do you remember," he said, "the first time I came to your door?" "I remember," she said. "You had my heifers." "I was terrified," he said. She looked up at him. "You were not." "I was completely terrified," he said. "I just did not show it." "Why terrified?" she asked. "Because I had already decided I wanted to know you better, and I was not sure you were going to let me," he said. "And then you looked at me with that expression you have." "What expression?" the one that assesses everything and gives away nothing," he said. "And I thought, I have no idea whether this woman finds me interesting or insufferable." "I found you interesting," she said. "I thought you might be slightly insufferable as well. It seemed possible both were true." "And now?" he asked. She considered him with those dark, precise eyes, and the fiddle played, and the lantern light moved over the faces of their neighbors and friends and the town they had become part of. "Interesting," she said. "Occasionally insufferable. Irreplaceable." He pulled her a little closer, and she let him, and they danced until the fiddles stopped. The years settled into the comfortable texture of a full life. Elias grew from the energetic, headlong boy he had been as a toddler into a child of 8 who had an absolute passion for horses that exceeded everyone else in the family, including his father, and who spent every available hour in the paddock, learning the language of his particular obsession with total dedication. Thomas at 10 was quiet and methodical, and had begun accompanying his father on the cattle count with the focus of someone preparing for a genuine responsibility. Clara at 7 was exactly what Vera had predicted, ruthlessly capable at everything she chose to pursue and openly uninterested in everything she did not. In 1895, Vera received a letter from her brother in St. Louis, who had sent what money he could in the hard years. He wrote to tell her he was planning to come west with his wife and their 2 young children, that the printing trade in St. Louis had become crowded, and he had heard good things about the Texas cattle country, and wondered if there might be land available near Redemption Creek. Vera wrote back the same day with a description of the adjacent property on the southern side of their ranch, which had recently become available, and a detailed account of the current land prices, the water situation, and the practical realities of cattle ranching in the region, along with an honest assessment of what the first 2 years would require, because she was not going to let her brother walk into something she had not warned him about. He arrived in October of 1895 with his wife Helen and their 2 children, a boy of 4 named Robert and a girl of 6 named Amelia. And the reunion was warm and full of the particular emotion of 2 people who had been separated by distance and difficulty, and were now, entirely unexpectedly, close again. Vera's brother, whose name was David Everett, was a practical and good-humored man of 34 who took to the land with more natural ability than he had any prior evidence of, and he and Isaac developed an easy friendship based on mutual respect and the efficient division of labor on their neighboring properties. The ranch house that David and Helen built on the southern property was finished by the following spring, and the 2 families fell into the habit of Sunday dinners that rotated between the 2 houses, a custom that became the anchor of both families' weeks, and that persisted through weather and seasonal work, and everything else that life produced. Thomas Lorne, at 12, took a serious and somewhat solemn interest in his younger cousins that revealed a capacity for patience his parents found touching. Clara, at 9, was a magnetic and sometimes chaotic force in her cousins' lives, particularly Amelia's, who adored her with the uncritical devotion of a younger child for an older one. Elias and young Robert were simply loud and inseparable and frequently muddy. "We have become a very large family," Vera said one Sunday evening in 1896, sitting on the porch with Isaac after the Everetts had driven back down the road. "We have," he agreed. "I did not expect this," she said. "When I came here, what did you expect?" She thought about it honestly the way she thought about most things. To survive, she said. To hold the land, possibly to be alone doing it in the way I had been doing most things alone for the preceding year. A pause. "I did not expect any of this." He reached over and took her hand. "Are you glad?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "I am glad," she said. I am so glad I cannot entirely say it." He looked at her profile in the evening light. The woman who had stood in a yard with a fence stretcher and the full weight of everything on her shoulders, and had not asked for help, but had accepted it when it came, and had built from it something he would not have known how to imagine before he had seen it take shape. "I love you," he said. She turned to look at him, and the expression was the one without reserve, the one she had slowly learned to let him see, and it still moved through him with the same force it had the first time. "I love you too," she said. "You impossible, honest, wonderful man." She would think about all of it. The letter, the cold kitchen, the fence line, the man with the gray eyes who had driven 2 feet of post with great competence, the broken podium, the injunction, the February letter from Crane, the kiss in the kitchen, the vows under the oak tree, the children, the Sundays, all of it, the whole accumulation of a life that had grown from the place where everything might have ended. Isaac would find her there, as he always had, because after all these years he still knew when she had gone quiet and how long to wait. He would come and stand beside her and look at the water with her, and she would lean against him, and he would put his arm around her, and neither of them would need to say what they were thinking because they both already knew. The creek ran on, catching the light, endlessly moving and endlessly itself, and the land lay quiet around them, and it was theirs, and they were here, and everything that had been broken and frightened and uncertain was now, through the long, steady work of 2 people who had chosen each other and meant it, whole.